Started out as a deal with Nintendo gone wrong, turned into one of the best-selling systems ever. Now, before we talk about PlayStation, let's go back a little bit to the SNES. So, when the SNES was being made, one of the Sony execs actually helped with it. He worked on the sound chip that made the SNES sound as good as it did. And that was sort of Sony's first foray into the game industry, because they'd never been in it. They've made like the Walkman, they've made a bunch of other stuff in the 90s, but this would have been like a whole new venture for them at this point. And since they were already working with Nintendo, they thought that they could sort of scrap up a deal with them. And for a time, they did have a good deal where, Sony would release a CD add-on that can also play SNES games. That didn't really go to plan because while Sony did announce the merger and like the project that them and Nintendo are working on, at the same time, Nintendo at the same exact show hit them with a big middle finger and basically decided to work with Philips. Nintendo had a backroom deal with Philips, and because both companies were from Japan, and the fact that Philips is from Europe, it's considered a no-no in Japan, like to choose a foreign piece of media versus a, regular piece. So you can imagine Sony's execs were very furious about this betrayal. It got to a point where basically they even asked Sega if they wanted to do a merger, and Sega almost did, but then they refused because Sega Japan just didn't know how to do business. Philips, when they released their CDI a couple of years before the PlayStation, it was a bomb in the bad sense. It barely sold any units. It was too much money for people. So the whole reason they made a deal just stopped working pretty much. So in a last-ditch effort, Ken Kutaragi decided to tell the CEO, we need to make it. And the CEO of Sony ended up saying, do it. So they did. PlayStation would release in 1994 in Japan and 1995 in the United States, and it was a banger of a system. It outsold Nintendo and the Sega Saturn. In fact, even if you double the numbers, PlayStation still outsells them at over 100 million units by the end of its lifespan. Now, what's the reason for this, you may ask? Well, there's a very good reason, actually. Sony decided to use discs like they were going to do with the Nintendo PlayStation. Nintendo decided with their Nintendo 64 to stick with cartridges. Now, the problem with cartridges is you can't hold as much data like cutscenes or sounds. So for a game like, I'll give you an example, like Final Fantasy VII, that's like 4 discs on PS1. If they made that on the Nintendo 64, that would have been like 6 or 7 discs instead of 4. Just to show how big of a gap the memory can be in terms of that. Sony had some smash hits like one of the first rhythm games, Parappa the Rapper, where you play as a rapping dog. And then there's Crash Bandicoot, a really well-liked platformer for the system to compete with Mario 64. Nintendo, once the king in the gaming industry back during the NES and SNES era, now kicked down to second place by PlayStation. It's kind of funny irony that it was Nintendo that caused that by making the deal with Philips. You also had unique platformers like Ape Escape that utilized the DualShock. Oh, let me tell you about the DualShock. When they first released the PlayStation, they started with what was called the digital controller, which just had a D-pad. The analog controller, the DualShock, has 2 analog sticks, which is very unique. While Nintendo had the first analog stick for a system. Sony was the first one to do dual analog sticks, which really worked out at the end of the day, because you need a camera, sort of thing. And let's not forget one of the most popular games from the PlayStation 1, Twisted Metal from 1995. A franchise that's been going for a good time. There's also games like Gran Turismo, Medieval, Spyro the Dragon, and many, many more, including Jammerlania as well, which is where I got my PFP from. Riding high on the success of the PlayStation, in 1999 Sony announces the PlayStation 2. The PlayStation 2 would then release in March of 2000 in Japan and late in 2000 in most other countries. Their only competition early on was really just the Sega Dreamcast, and that system was doing really bad by that point. Sony had a very big ace up their sleeve with the DVD technology. You could watch movies on your PlayStation 2, which was like a first for a game console, and you could play music CDs as well. The best feature, though, that came with the PS2 that is backwards compatibility. You could play any PS1 game that you've owned on your PS1 on your PlayStation 2. You can even use a PS1 remote and a PS1 memory card on it. So it was completely backwards compatible with almost everything that was on the original PlayStation, making it like a really good sell. Within a year's time, the Nintendo GameCube and the Microsoft Xbox would come out. Oh, I forgot to mention Microsoft. They worked with Sega on the Dreamcast for a period of time to have Windows CE put on it, but after Sega's Xbox decided, alright, we're gonna make our own system. And for a first system, it did pretty good. Although, again, like with the PS1, you could probably double or triple the numbers Nintendo, Xbox, and Sega Dreamcast got, and you still wouldn't reach the numbers the PlayStation 2 got. While early on their game library was kind of mediocre, eventually they would end up getting a lot of banger games like Ape Escape 2, Ratchet and Clank, Jak and Daxter: The Precursor Legacy, Twisted Metal Black, Killzone, God of War, and let's not forget the best Ape Escape 3. While they're a little late to the party, unlike Microsoft, Sony did add online play to their system through like an adapter, basically. And a decent amount of games utilized it, like Ratchet and Clank Up Your Arsenal, the ATV Off-Road Fury sequels, Gran Turismo 4, Jak X Combat Racing, Call of Duty 2, Crash Tag Team Racing, and many, many more. PlayStation was riding so high it felt like nobody could touch them. Although, that would change when the Xbox 360 was announced. Understanding the mistakes that previous systems made, the Xbox 360 basically made the choice to release their system early. Now, that would end up having some bad effects for them, but we'll talk about that in another video. So it released in late 2005. While PlayStation was still a little bit behind on their PlayStation 3. And from early showings, especially by the time it was E3 2006, it wasn't really very promising looking.
$599 US. The stages of the game will also be based on famous battles which actually took place in ancient Japan. So here's this giant enemy crab.
It's Ridge Racer! Ridge Racer!
Had a very strange boomerang-shaped controller which got a lot of hate, so they ended up changing it. But the biggest crime is the same crime Sega made with the Sega Saturn, which was they made the price way too high.
$599 US.
Especially compared to its competition. So due to its established player base, 360 was thriving early on, while PlayStation 3 was basically down in the dumps at that point. Slowly but surely, Sony got better with their systems and started to catch up with Xbox 360, although both systems weren't really able to combat the Wii. PlayStation 3 had a lot of well-known games like Uncharted, Drake's Fortune, Resistance, the Ratchet and Clank Future games, the later Killzone games, God of War 3 and Ascension, Infamous, and Little Big Planet. While its online wasn't perfect, Sony PS3 had one ace up its sleeve against the Xbox 360. So for 360, you had to pay for Xbox Live Gold to play online. Back during the PS3 era, you didn't have to pay a dime for the online. except for like a few games back in 2011, but most games you were able to sort of play online from the get-go. One big thing the PlayStation 3 struggled with is it was more powerful than the 360, right? But the problem is it's kind of like the Sega Saturn again. It was hard to make games for. So a lot of multi-platform games looked a lot better on the 360 than they did on the PS3 because of that. Sony had a very good idea when it came to coming back into the game market. So now they released the PlayStation 3 Slim, and the nice thing about the PlayStation 3 Slim is it's a lot cheaper, although it's at the cost of PlayStation 2 backwards compatibility. But you can still play PS1 discs at least. Both Sony and Xbox would try to compete with the Wii by making the PlayStation Move for Sony and the Xbox Kinect for Microsoft. Now, Kinect lasted a bit longer. PlayStation Move, kinda died pretty quickly and didn't have a lot of games for it, so that was kind of a waste of space for the system. And just to show how little the PlayStation Move library was, I've only ever had one game from the PlayStation Move, and that was PlayStation Move Heroes, which is a very disappointing crossover game between Jak, Ratchet, and Sly. Due to the Move's failure, Sony focused more on regular first-party games, while a lot of Xbox's games they kept showing at E3 were like Kinect-themed games, and just games that weren't for like the average gaming audience. So Sony was slowly catching up because of that. That was until one moment, though.
April 2nd, 2011. A group of hackers known as Anonymous begins Operation Sony, an attempt to disrupt Sony websites. The demand is Sony leave HOTS alone. April 11th, 2011. Sony settles with HOTS. Details are scarce, but HOTS agrees to take down his website and info on how to jailbreak the PS3. April 13th, 2011. In a creepy video message, Anonymous calls for a day of Sony protest and warns of an incoming attack. April 16th and 17th, 2011. Hackers digitally break into the PlayStation Network and Sony Online Entertainment. They steal personal PSN and Sony Online Entertainment user information, along with European SOE credit card and debit card numbers.
In 2011, PlayStation Network would get hacked, and they would have to apologize to all their customers and give them a buyback deal. So that really threw a hammer into PlayStation 3. Over the next couple years, however, PlayStation was slowly getting better sales-wise and catching up once again. And the thing that really pushed it over the edge was probably The Last of Us, which was, ironically, one of the last exclusives released on the PlayStation 3. And not by much, but by a little bit worldwide, PlayStation 3 in the end was able to outsell the Xbox 360, 87 million to 84 million. But now the next generation is on the horizon, and that would be the PlayStation 4 and the dumbly titled Xbox One? Now this situation was a complete mirror flip of what happened with the PS3 and 360, because when they announced the Xbox One, they called it that because it's like everything in one, basically. And they announced that you can't share games with friends because if you do, it won't let you play a certain game. So that was a big thing that gamers got upset about. And Sony came in and did this.
This is how you share your games on PS4.
Thanks.
PlayStation.
There's not really much to refer to past that point aside from Nintendo's fall and resurgence, which might be something I'll talk about as well. But in terms of PlayStation, they've been pretty consistently doing better than Xbox for the last decade now. That's all I gotta say though. I hope you all have a good one, and I'm out. Peace.